Namaste and greetings. I am Mahima Kapoor, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi. Welcome you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. The COVID-19 pandemic has deepened the pre-existing inequalities across socioeconomic groups. The distressing images of migrant exodus remain etched in our minds, but not a lot has changed in terms of data collection and policy making since then. To understand the concept of cohesive development and its correlation with inequality, specifically the migration crisis of Europe and the USA, we have gathered for a talk under the series, The State of Development Discourses, #Cohesive Development, with Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi on the role of equality for cohesive development. This deliberation is being organized by the IMPRI Center for Human Dignity and Development and Center for Development Communication and Studies, Jaipur. I feel honored to introduce the moderator, Professor Sunil Ray. Sir is the former director, A.N. Sinha Institute of Social Studies, Patna, and advisor at SEDEX and IMPRI. Professor Ray has 35 years of experience in research and teaching in the field of environmental economics, political economy of development, rural development, and institutional economics. His papers have been published extensively in reputed national and international journals. He has authored several books, including Industrial Growth and Protection in India, Natural Resources, Organization and Technology Linkages, Agricultural Services and the Poor, Management of Natural Resources, Institutions for Sustainable Livelihood, and Theorizing Cohesive Development and Alternative Paradigm. Welcome, sir. I feel privileged to introduce the speaker, Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi. Sir is an Emeritus Professor, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, and an Adjunct Professor, Monash University. He has taught, researched, and guided research in many institutions and universities across the globe. He has been a member of the State Planning Board, Government of West Bengal, governing body of the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, and the Institute of the Studies in Industrial Development, New Delhi, among others. He has acted as external collaborator and consultant for the ILO, UNCLAD, and ESCAPE. He founded the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata in 2002 and directed it until his retirement in 2012. His research interests include finance, human development issues, and other aspects of development, and the prospects of democracy in a globalizing world. His books include The Political Economy of Underdevelopment, The Development State in History and in the 20th Century, Democracy and Development, Capture and Exclude, Developing Economies and the Poor in Global Finance. In the year 2005, Sir received the Padma Shri by the Government of India. Welcome, sir. We are fortunate to have Dr. Arup Kumar Sen, Professor Atanu, Sengupta, and Dr. Gopal Krishna, and Dr. Mansee Bal Bhargava as the discussants of the session. Dr. Sen is an Associate Professor, Department of Commerce, Serampore College, Kolkata. Welcome, sir. Professor Sengupta is a Professor, Department of Economics, the University of Burdwan, West Bengal. Welcome, sir. Dr. Krishna is a Guest Fellow, Faculty of Law, Humboldt University, Berlin, and Fellow, IRGAC-Berlin. Welcome, sir. And Dr. Bhargava is an entrepreneur, researcher, and educator, and former executive director at South Asia Consortium for Interdisciplinary Water Resources Studies. Welcome, ma'am. Now I invite Professor Ray to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohima. Thank you so much for your nice introduction. respected Professor Bagchi, enlightened discussants, Dr. Arjun Kumar, the director of IMPRI, and his colleagues. First of all, I must thank Dr. Arjun Kumar and his colleagues to have given me an opportunity to moderate the session in which Professor, no less than Professor Bagchi, is going to deliver the lecture on very important topic, role of equality for cohesive development. To be honest with you, I feel privileged to moderate the discussion on such an important talk to be delivered by no less than Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi. I still remember the kind of course, I always treat him as my teacher, although directly I was not taught by him, but still learned quite a bit, have been learning. But outstanding scholar is quoted, his works have been quoted all over the world. Those who know his works, they will be saying the same thing what I'm talking about. One of the significant works that he did, I thought that I must bring it to your notice, maybe that many of you know, The Perilous Passage, Mankind and the Global Ascendancy of Capital. This has come out in 2008 by Cambridge Publications. It's an outstanding work. Is quoted widely throughout the world. So I feel so happy that he is here with us with IMPRI to deliver his talk. Maybe today's discussion, the migration crisis, it could be legacy of the work that has been doing, but fortunately, this is an area. I think there are around 20 lectures have taken place over here, was organized by IMPRI. But focusing on this aspect was not there anywhere. This is the first of its kind being focused, the how imperialism, but the past history of what's called exploiting the third world countries have been creating a different kind of a problem altogether, even in some name or the other, like migration crisis that you have highlighted, is something which is very important for us to learn about how they have been doing. Whether we talk about what is called Latin American countries, and America or North America and the Latin American countries, Africa, and being what is called resources being exploited, taken over by the same age-old imperialist power like Europe, or you talk about what is called the NATO smashing the Middle East or Central Asia or the Middle East. Now the problem is that this is something which abstract that you have already pointed out as something which is very for us to know more about it. It is a global power structure that has been continuing. It's manifesting in a different form altogether. And it will continue to form because it is, as you said, the ascendancy of capital. It's capital that has been determining everything. What is true, perhaps, to begin with? Well, this is what my presumption is true for that you are talking about, going to talk about, which is going to be enlightening for us. At the same time, it's very important for us to take note of what has been the amount or number of displacement in countries like India for the natural resources by the MNCs and all that, especially in a place like Chhattisgarh. It reminds me, maybe that we can talk about later to have a connection between the two. But then again, at the micro level, the country level, this is also has been happening. And you have the fascist group like Salvajudo. You had this kind of history just a few years ago. Well, this is what has been the story all over. It's the capital that has been determining everything. And that is what exactly it's all about. I'm sure your talk is going to be teaching every one of us in a different way as to how really the unequal society is something which can never really bring about a change for the society when things have been happening like that. Now the question is that, sir, what's the way out? That is precisely where I would like to ask a question later on, perhaps a cohesive development approach that you have talked about, which is very nicely right in the interaction. Cohesive development could be an approach, could be a paradigm, that need to be followed later on to really rectify a situation like this, to come out, the humanity can come out from this kind of unequal society. Purely for the survival of the human race today, that is something which has been a great challenge for every one of us to think about. With this very brief introduction, I must also share with you Professor Bagchi, in our volume, that theories in cohesive development, made a very fascinating, stimulating contribution in the paper. Is added value to the book to a large extent. I really am thankful. I take this opportunity to thank him again for this one. With very few words, may I request now Professor Bagchi to speak on, to talk on what's called the topic, which is inequality. Role of equality for cohesive development, how the equality can really work for cohesive development, and how the inequality can be really banished. Thank you so much. Now, may I request Professor Bagchi to take over the mic.
Let me first of all thank IMPRI, its director, Dr. Arjun Kumar, and Professor Sengupta for arranging this very important talk for me. I have met Professor Rai quite a number of times, Dr. Arup Sen quite a number of times, but the other discussants I have not met before. So may I also welcome Discussants, Atanu, Dr. Gopal Krishna, Dr. Bhargava, and to the extent that is possible, I would like to interact with them, answer any questions that I am capable of answering later on. This talk is primarily devoted to international migration, but at the end of the talk, I'll speak about the relevance of some of the issues that I have raised in this particular, in the context of international migration, that may be also applicable to the case of internal migration in India. Without any further ado, let me start by reading out some of the things that I have written now. Cohesive development requires that human beings would cohere with one another, that they should live in harmony and thrive in health, education, cognitive development, and have opportunities for doing the kind of work they want to do, like being a worker in a factory, in a field, in a kitchen, in administration, in scientific investigation, in music, in plastic arts, and so on. Cohesive development also means that human beings must also respect the boundaries of nature. The disrespect for the boundaries of nature has resulted in enormous disasters, which are known to all of us. I will cite only a few of them. In 2010, there was an enormous landslide and glacier slide in Uttarakhand, which killed many people, destroyed many temples, made the route to Kedarnath impossible for quite a few months. And all this was the result of the attempt of the government of India, Western people, to get to Kedarnath through a 4-lane drive. Earlier on, pilgrims used to travel on foot. That was part of the real pilgrimage that they did. And now they will want to do that kind of work and want to drive there. And that resulted in this kind of disaster. You have also seen that in Northwest America, there is enormous heat. Sometimes the heat was much stronger than in Rajasthan, and it killed at least 500 people, killed probably several million birds, and caused wildfires, and so on. The the change in the climate has resulted in disasters, particularly for small islands in the Sundarbans, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. The Maldives government has had to hold meetings as an exercise under the water. So it's very important that human beings should respect boundaries of nature. The boundaries that were indicated by many of our great predecessors like Rabindranath Tagore, Karl Marx, and so on. Now, the question of equality and inequality has been debated in the world very long time. Human beings, from the very beginning that they began to live in communities, unfortunately, have had to struggle against inequality. Even the primitive communist societies had differences between the chief and the others, and between men and women. But these inequalities increased much more with what is called civil society or civilization. As Rousseau, who was the first thinker who systematically talked about the origins of inequality, said the first man who enclosed a piece of ground and said that this is mine was the founder of civil society, which has led to so many murders, so many wars, and so much discontent throughout the world. But unfortunately, Rousseau talked only about the need for equality between men, but not among women. He thought that women should serve men. Later on, when Tom Paine also talked about the rights of man, it was rights of man. And it was against him that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her Vindication of the Rights of Women. But I think the first thinker who systematically investigated and demanded equality of men was the Marquis de Condorcet. Already in 1780s, he was writing about that. So I won't go into that history here. And as Professor Ray has already indicated, my main topic of discussion today is international migration. So I'll come to that topic now. Now, in recent times, for the last, say, 10 years or so, or much more strikingly from 2015, the newspapers have been full of the migration crisis of Europe and the migration crisis of the United States. The migration crisis of Europe is really not the migration crisis of Europe, but the migration crisis of African countries and of the Middle East. And as Professor Ray has already indicated, the root cause of these migration crisis, really the earlier onslaughts on the countries that they colonized practically all of Africa, except Ethiopia, which was free until Mussolini occupied it in the 1930s, and then again it became free. They occupied practically most of Asia except China formerly and Thailand, and they also occupied practically all of the Middle Eastern countries except Turkey by the end of the Second World War. These have left deep impressions on these countries. I'll come to some of the definite results of this. One of the interesting points is that while the Western countries preached and practiced in many cases, not always, because as you know, in England, Protestantism was the accepted religion from the time of Henry VIII until 1830, until when Roman Catholicism was practically either banned or was the Roman Catholics are treated as second-class citizens. The same thing can be said about France and so on. But from the time of the of the Enlightenment, particularly from the time of Rousseau, Voltaire, later on Condorcet, and the French Revolution, they preached rationality, they preached secularism, and gradually most of the European countries became secular in particular ways. There are still problems about that secularism because, for example, in France, Orthodox Jews are allowed to use caps on their heads. Hijabs have been banned in public schools and in many other public places. So that secularism is also faulty. But given that, on the whole, these countries can be, but interestingly enough, in the Middle Eastern countries, they backed the Islamists. They backed Muslim Brotherhood against Jamal Abdel Nasser. They backed Mujahideen against the communist-leaning regime of Afghanistan. The revolution there was not really brought out by the Soviet Union. When they were attacked by the Mujahideen, then the Soviet Union came in. The revolution was carried out by two communist parties, which unfortunately fought with one another, Khalq and Parcham. And these parties tried to educate the Afghans, gave the women more rights than they had ever enjoyed, and that they had some success and popular support was shown that the last ruler, Najibullah, hung on until 1992, 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. But with the support of Mujahideen, the Americans made the Russians embroiled in the war, and it was one of the causes of the downfall of the Soviet Union because they became overstretched and couldn't simply afford this kind of war. And they thought that it was worth the expenditure for doing that. But what happened was that as a result, Al-Qaeda came up with Osama bin Laden as the leader. And then they carried out the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Tower in New York and on the Pentagon. And when Iraq was virtually destroyed by two different wars against Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria came up. And this ISIS has now had many sister organizations coming up in Africa. Its own tentacles have spread from down to Mozambique, where they're given a lot of, has also spawned like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, and many other outfits in places like Mali and Sudan and so on. Now, take the case of Iraq. Saddam Hussein came up with American support. Earlier on, the Iraqi Communist Party was the biggest communist party in the Middle East. In order to dislodge that, they encouraged the Ba'athist Party, of which Saddam was a leader. And when Saddam came up, they used Saddam against Iran. They supported Saddam, they in fact instigated Saddam to attack Iran, and they supported Saddam during that period. But Saddam proved to be a recalcitrant collaborator. He then attacked Kuwait, which had been separated by the British in order primarily to get better hold of the oil of Kuwait. So when Saddam attacked Kuwait, Americans attacked him and defeated him and imposed, I'm saying Americans, but really it is the whole NATO powers. The United States is only one member of that, but one of the leading, in fact, the leading member now. And these NATO powers then imposed sanctions. And Jean Drèze had estimated that by the 1990s, that to the death, extra death of at least 500,000 children in Iraq. Then again, around the beginning of the 2000s, they attacked Saddam. Saddam unfortunately hung on. They again attacked Saddam on the entirely false accusation that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction. That allegation was disproved by the United Nations inspectors led by El Baradei, an Egyptian, and also by the arms expert of Britain. Tony Blair, unfortunately, was the Labour leader at that time. He was as bad as George Bush. And that man had to commit suicide because the government would not allow him to publish his results at that time. So this is the way that the NATO powers have treated this Middle Eastern country. Not only in the case of Iraq, also in the case of Somalia, it was American intervention in support of one faction of the Somalian world leaders against the other that caused civil war. And I had the experience when I was visiting Nairobi as a reviewer for the Codesia research projects. I was staying in a hotel and there was a Somalian girl also staying there. She was probably already being educated in the United States or Britain. And she told me with tears in her eyes that one of her cousins who was staying in a camp in Kenya was not allowed to enter the hotel because she did not have the right clothing. Now that's just one of the human conditions that they have reduced them to. Now, let me get on with the narrative now. Let us take several other cases in the Middle East. Libya was ruled for a very long time, I think from about 69 or 70 until the 2010 or so. I can't remember the exact year. By Gaddafi, totally authoritarian, there is no question about that. But so were all the Middle Easterns at that time. But he had the ability to use his oil to make Libya, in fact, the richest country in Africa, barring Botswana and South Africa. When Gaddafi was attacked by the NATO powers and was killed in a very cruel way, a civil war started because the government imposed by the outside powers was not accepted by the military leaders loyal to Gaddafi, and one particular leader, Haftar, went on fighting him. So that caused enormous damage among the Libyans and displacement of the people. Every civil war causes an enormous displacement and leads to the increase of flow of migrants. Libya then was made an outpost for Europe, and people trying to reach Europe from Africa and other Middle Eastern countries were detained there and were treated extremely cruelly by the security guards. Take another case, the case of Yemen. Yemen was again there, the ruler imposed by the outside forces was opposed by the Houthis, who were partly backed by Iran, but Iran was at a distance. And Houthis have gone on fighting Saudi Arabia and the Emirates until now. You have seen in the papers that they bombed the Abu Dhabi airport and some people were killed, including 2 Indians. Now, this war has led to what the United Nations has called the greatest humanitarian disaster in recent history. In all these cases, there have been enormous numbers of migrants coming out trying to reach Europe, because that's the only place they know they can get some security and some income. Now, yes, take for example the case of war in Syria, which is now 10 years old. The Assad regime was authoritarian and there are protests against it. NATO powers encouraged these protests and tried to effect a regime change. Were there no other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East? Israel was engaged in ethnic cleansing of the Arabs, defying international law, even UN Assembly resolutions, but with the strong support of NATO powers. Saudi Arabia was not just authoritarian, but medieval in its punishment methods. I think they still cut off hands as one of the measures of punishment. And its treatment of women, let alone the immigrants who come in for domestic work. The same restriction will be valid for Qatar and the Emirates sheikdoms. But the NATO powers would not lift a finger for bringing down their degree of authoritarianism or the long drawn out genocide of the Palestinians affected by the Israelis. But they wanted a regime change in Syria because the ruling regime was secular and more aligned with Russia. What happened after NATO intervention? The country was divided. There was a prolonged civil war. In fact, defying all our earlier precedents, Turkey came in support of Russia because Syrian refugees were crowding into Turkey and Turkey wanted to prevent that kind of thing. There was enormous displacement of the civilian population and endless suffering for them. And Syrian refugees formed the front of the so-called migration crisis of Europe. The European countries are not going to welcome them, except for Germany under Angela Merkel. I think under the new so-called leftist regime, the situation will change. Except for Germany, none of the other countries were welcoming. The targets of the immigrants were Italy, France, Britain, and Germany. The point is that the countries from which the migrants originated were very much poorer than the European countries. I'll just cite some figures here. Whereas, for example, the incomes of Switzerland, all in 2020 US dollars, Norway, United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy were 80,296, 75,428, 59,937, that is the United States, 44,680, 30,827, 39,532, and 32,366, the lowest in Italy, respectively. The GDP per capita, for example, of Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia were 509, just $509, $824, and $399. And ironically, Somalians are crowding into war-torn Yemen. Where will they go? That is the nearest point that they can think of. They just come across the channel and enter that country. In all these cases of civil wars, as I have already said, the basic cause is that the Western countries have imposed their own men as rulers of these countries. And the point is that once the civil war starts, the Western countries can't do anything about that. And they don't want to do anything. The United Nations calls for settlement. They try to, well, how will they settle? Unless they actually can really give proper aid to these countries unconditionally and allow the people to choose their own rulers, the civil wars will go on. So once they stimulate these civil wars, then they just leave the country's population in large. In trying to reach Europe across the Mediterranean at a very conservative estimate, between 2014 and 2021, 21,894 migrants met a watery death. This is an underestimate because in many cases, when the boats sink in the Mediterranean, nobody knows because they were all undocumented migrants. Moreover, several hundreds are dying every year trying to cross the English Channel from France to Britain, to be detained in the camps of a very unwelcoming Priti Patel. That is also an irony. Priti Patel is an immigrant into the United States, in the United Kingdom, and she has been the most horribly oppressive home minister as far as migrants are concerned there. It's like a crowded bus. When somebody tries to get in many cases, there are people who get somebody's hand and take them in, but some others say, no, Dada, no, there is no place for it. That's the attitude of these immigrants in the United Kingdom. They're doing very well. Rishi Sunak is the finance minister there. Priti Patel is the home minister. And there are several other persons like that. Let us now turn to the migration crisis of the United States. Like the case of the would-be migrants from Haiti, take the case of the would-be migrants from Haiti. The political turbulence and the poverty of the country is Washington's making. President Woodrow Wilson sent Marines to Haiti between once the President Monroe promulgated the Monroe Doctrine, which said that no outside power would be allowed to interfere in the affairs of Latin America. Only once this was violated when the French imposed Maximilian as the president of Mexico, but he was soon thrown out. But they also wanted the rulers to kowtow to Washington. They regarded the whole of Latin America, particularly after the British hegemony was over, as their backyard. And not only Latin America, but not only South America, but Central America and the Caribbean. So take the case of Haiti. President Woodrow Wilson sent Marines to Haiti it was the first country which had liberated the blacks and was ruled by the blacks from the 1800 onwards. Between 1915 and 1934. The United States handpicked the country's leaders, imposed forced labor on peasants, brutally repressed the Caucus Rebellion, and under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a great president as far as the United States is concerned, ripped up the country's revolutionary constitution and imposed a new one that allowed foreign ownership of the country's land. To ensure order, when it left, the US created and backed the dreaded Haitian military, the forces armies of Haiti, whose only function was to repress the country's people. During the Cold War, the US backed the brutal dictatorship of François Papa Doc Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier as an anti-communist counterweight to Fidel Castro's Cuba. The Duvaliers ruled from 1957 to 1986 through state terror carried out by its murderous paramilitary, the Tonton Macoute. What was Washington's tolerance, if not encouragement, the father-son dictatorship killed as many as 60,000 people, especially socialists and advocates of democracy and social reform. The legacy of Tonton Macoute and the US war on drugs is such that recently a Haitian president was assassinated by Colombian mercenaries in collaboration with local gangs, and the next president had to flee for fear of his life. No wonder thousands of Haitians tried to reach the United States, only to be detained by the Trump-era policy of Fortress USA continued by President Biden and deported back to Haiti again. From the 19th century, the United Fruit Company and other US corporations created banana republics in Central America, bribing local politicians to overlook the savage repression of workers, unconscionable exploitation of peasants, and preventing any attempt at industrialization and upliftment. Washington did more than that. It sent in its army to dislodge any leader with democratic or egalitarian intentions. In 1952, it removed Gustavo Arbenz, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, who tried to introduce land reforms. In the 1980s, it financed and armed the paramilitary Contras to fight the Sandinistas, who had thrown out the brutal Somocista regime in Nicaragua. More recently, it removed Manuel Zelaya, the democratically elected president of Honduras, by effecting a military coup. In 2018, from Honduras alone, migrants numbering between 4,000 and 10,000 were trying to reach the United States by traveling on foot via Mexico. Many of them die on the road out of thirst or starvation. Many of them are drowned in the river Rio Grande. Most of them are detained in Mexico or in detention camps at the US border, where they are horribly treated. Children, for example, were separated from parents in a routine manner before being turned back. The story of Honduras is repeated in every Central American country. Between 1994 and 2017, at least 10,000 people died trying to cross the Mexico-US border. The United States also trained many of the dictators and top military leaders of Latin America in a school of the Americans. Its war on drugs and use of local police and paramilitary forces led to the wide diffusion of arms among drug peddlers and other gangs, and led to endemic violence in all the countries of Central America and Mexico. The drug gangs are so powerful in Mexico that the police often look the other way around when a drug gang is operating. This endemic violence also depresses productive investment and further depresses the per capita incomes of these republics. The migrants are fleeing both the poverty and violence, so the US migration crisis is its own creation. The United States would not welcome migrants, even though the US Fire Service and the cultivation of fruits in California would come to a halt if these unwelcome and ill-treated migrants were not there. Now, with all this, what is the kind of policy that we should advocate that India should pursue? India should, in every case, in every forum, in the United Nations, in Assembly, should plead that the Europeans should accept the migrants because it is against international law when people are seeking asylum for genuine reasons, whether reasons of economic deprivation or reasons of political oppression. It should also interact with the UN organizations like UNICEF, FAO, UNHCR, UNDP, in order to see how much they can do in order to alleviate the condition of the migrants. This should be the India's policies. Unfortunately, this government has not been at all active in any of these areas. India has a long pull in the United Nations Assembly, after all. It was the leader of the G20 countries in the 1970s, and the new economic order was being bruited about. Now, the story of international migration has many parallels in our country. In our country also, after the promulgation of the Citizenship Amendment Act, many of the people who have lived here for generations, many of their members have served in India's armed forces, have been declared as illegal aliens or foreigners. Particularly in Assam, they have been detained in camps, and there they have been very badly treated all through. The newspapers are all the time full of that. Apart from that, during the pandemic, when lockdown was suddenly declared, the migrants desperately tried to reach their home. And on their way, they are suffocated in overcrowded railway carriages. They died of thirst and hunger. Many of them were crushed by the railway tracks by incoming trains because they were resting on those tracks out of sheer tiredness. And many of them were crushed by trucks. And when they reached home, there was no jobs for them because they had left precisely because there are no jobs there. And there is no state policy in most cases for treating these migrants. The only exceptions I know is to some extent Odisha and Kerala. They are, particularly in Kerala, they have made special provisions for the treatment of the migrant workers. These migrants are not only deprived of employment and income, that children cannot go to school, they do not have any stable place to occupy. There have been, it is not just during the pandemic, but throughout the last, almost after independence, these have been documented by people like Ian Breman and his associates, several workers in Andhra Pradesh. They have worked in brick kilns, they have worked in sugar farms in Gujarat without any security and without any prospect of further improvement in their lives. What we should demand is that there should be a national policy for treatment of these migrants to see that when they do not have jobs, they have a minimum income wherever they work. India, after all, is one single country. It is not divided between different countries. So either the central government or through the central government, the state government should support those migrants who do not have any work at that time and should make provision for particularly for the healthcare and education of the children and the mothers of those children. There are many other policies that I'm sure IMPRI workers and the discussions can think of. I'll just stop here.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Bagchi. It's a very rich exposure of the kind of a game being played in the name of democracy, especially by the imperialist forces at the world scale. is basically, as I could understand, is the power play or the game being played by the big capital or the corporate or the international capital that mediates its interest through the power structure. That is something which has been playing havoc to the human life. The whole question finally comes, will the civilization progress? No, it's stuck up. With the migration crisis that you talk about, now not only at the international and also starts upon Indian situation. Still, I remember it was estimated to be 40 crore, that is 1/3 of the total population in India on migration. They're vulnerable. They're pushed to the poverty. That is something which, can you imagine a country which talks about that going to reach the pedestal of the development and something third or fourth country, developed country in the world going to declare. And this is the state of affairs today in a country like India. Even the latest report of Oxfam is something eye-opening for every one of us. And something, again, you find the estimate says more than 6 crore people pushed to the poverty. Again, back. That is what has been the unequal society. Is it that we can think about what is called is a power structure both at the national level as well as the international level, where into which the corporate capital or the international capital or capital, mediates its own interest and sets up everything, the policy and so on and so forth. Maybe that a space could be created to see something good happens, to at least see the civilization crisis doesn't really get into we. But anyway, with this very brief, we felt is something very enlightening for every one of us, especially in the kind of migration crisis that you talked about is, is very important for us to learn quite a bit from this story. Is nothing how imperialism has been working at the world level in a different way altogether in the name of democracy. Now I shall open the discussion to the discussant. And I feel really so happy that all Professor Atanu Sengupta, Dr. Gopal Krishna, Dr. Mansee Bal Bhargava, and Dr. Arup Sen, all of you have joined this program. I feel so happy about all that. But before you start, I have forgotten to share something which you must know about. Actually, that is what I was sharing before the talk started by Professor Bagchi, that this IMPRI, they opened up this forum to look for different ideas, the new ideas, new approach, thinking of new paradigm of change, all this, and these young researchers, they have started working on this one. They have been all thinking together. It's very unique experiment they are doing with this. They do not want to fall in line with what has been happening for centuries or for decades in a country like India. They would like to see a difference. They want to get out of the box and see what the world could be. That is something which is very important for us to take note of. It is in this context that I thought that this forum could be of great useful for every one of us to learn. There are around 15 to 20 people spoke from countries, from inside and outside, all scholars. And they spoke, they contributed, and very fortunate thing, very happy thing to share with you that they are already started documenting and going to bring out a book very shortly based on the presentation and the discussion that takes place. So it's a kind of a small volume they are going to bring out very soon. So that's something which is very encouraging for us to really capture what has been talked about and all being discussed, because the very serious points that are being raised and all that in various forums, various discussions. Now, may I request Professor Atanu Sengupta to set the ball rolling. There are several issues one can talk about, but whatever you feel like, very frank, free, your reflections, your idea, your understanding, and you add up. That will be really great for us, to take forward the entire discussion further. Thank you so much. Professor Sengupta, yes.
Thank you all. And it is a great opportunity for me to be in front of a great teacher, Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi. His preliminary work on colonial India that started our journey when I was perhaps say first year MSc student in economics, even before that. And then he studies about State Bank and all those things. So it is really a great privilege for me to talk before him and to hear his excellent ideas. Now, the point that I would like to trace is about the another perspective which Professor Bagchi has notably made, that cohesive development also includes health. And the present pandemic has pointed out how the health and the health sector has also been minimalized or corporatized or sort of hegemonized by a hierarchical structure. Now, again, if we ponder through the history, now it is a very influential work by Professor Engels, Frederick Engels, on the conditions of the working class in England, which is one of the pioneer books that opened up how living status of the living styles of the workers in the English slums have bringing out a lot of diseases, various contagious diseases and airborne diseases, lot of space. Now, during that time, there were some thinking among other British political economists, for example, Malthus, who has pointed out that the poor should die in this way. And there was, that is, poor should not be given ration because that would speed up the price, and they should die in this type of health-related issues. And there was also the letter which was pointed out by Professor Amartya Sen in his famous book, Justice. The letter that was written to Ricardo by Mill, in which Mill felt that though the condition of England is very bad and many people would die, there is no way those people can be saved except to cut off their throat like pigs. So this was the attitude, and in this attitude, a new type of thinking started. Firstly, from the utopian socialists, some philanthropists, and then a very scientific study of Frederick Engels about the conditions of labor in England brought up these various issues, how health is related to living in very bad slums and so on and so forth. And it is very, at that time, the contrast was very much, because at that same time in the Victorian England, or at that time in the Industrial Revolution England, we see a lot of advertisement are coming of sprawling countryside home and vistas and greeneries together with the filthy living of the laborers. Then it was Virchow who took up this issue, Rudolf Virchow, and he was influenced by Engels, as he has said. And it was he who first pointed out the word called social medicine. And he pointed out that a lot of the diseases and a lot of these ailments which people have could have been treated or could have been meted out or at least mitigated if proper atmosphere is created, and the pressure on the healthcare in the form of so-called hospitals and all those things could have been substantially reduced. Now, we all know that Virchow supported the Paris Commune, and after the ruthless persecution of the Commune, it is very interesting that I am reading that one of the pioneers of Indian independent movement, Surendranath Banerjee, was present at Paris at that time when the case of the Paris Commune, when the Paris communers were convicted in that court. See, he wrote in his book, A Nation in Making, about a brief chapter of visiting the Paris and meeting the court proceedings of the Paris communers. Now, whatever it may be, these were the first beginnings that started. And however, unfortunately, there were several reasons why it did not flourish enough. One was perhaps the development of the idea of the germ theory, which was first started by preliminary finding in Germany and then Pasteur, which posited that germs germ was the basic causes of the diseases, and if proper attack is made on the germs, then most of our diseases could be dissolved. And finally, by the report which is known as the Flexner report in USA, it is given a more or less a mainstream basis, and all thinkings were mainly attested to those views of germ theory and preventing the germs. Though this alternative thinking was there. Now, it is not to say that germ theory was wrong. What was there, according to Walzin and Novorov, there was actually a shift from a mono causal to a from a multi-causal, sorry, to a monocausality. Beforehand, the germ theory, the multiple causes were coming on. But as if the new system of healthcare and the new system of health system, it began to trace mainly on the monocausalism or monocausality, and all the subsequent development of the drug industry in Germany and in other parts of Europe, and the growth of the capital, the investment in the pharmaceutical industries and all that, and ultimately the horrible experiment in the Nazi Holocaust camps. We all know what followed from that. Now, however, in that time, an alternative movement was also starting. Firstly, in United States of America, the workers were forming a type of cooperative, which they are calling mutual aids group and friendship groups. It started from the late 17th century and the early 19th century. Numerous such cooperatives began to be built, mostly in USA, because they felt that it was impossible for there was no public system of health at that time. There was only private, and it was almost impossible for the workers to buy the private healthcare. So they began to form cooperatives where they could accumulate some amount of fund. They gave 1 day salary and so on and so forth. So it is possible for them first to get the services of the physicians, and finally establishment of the dispensaries and all that. And when Karl Marx interacted with this, with some of these pioneers of the working fund and how they are working in order to mitigate the problem. Following these, interestingly, in 1873, the Prussian government under Bismarck, it passed the first universal health,
Professor Atanu, why not you just concentrate more on, because very important thing that you're talking about, but why not just concentrate more on what he has spoken about and what are the lessons that you learn and what you build up an argument based on that. I think that will be, these are all important and very relevant, but then because time shortage and all this there.
Yes, I will shorten my thing. Now, actually, I am speaking, I am coming to the point that is nowadays is called Bismarckian policy and Leninist policy of public health. Actually, public health has also two dimensions. I have read in Professor Bagchi's previous writing. One is to mitigate the workers' suffering so that they remain within limit, they do not make hallabol or so on, sir. And another is to empower the people. Public health also has two dimensions. As Professor has said rightly, now the migration, then if we conclude here, now additionally, I think these migrants, mostly if we consider India after the lockdown, there was a row between the state governments about who, because many a times these migrants were thought to be as COVID carriers or COVID bearers. Even I'm sorry to say that CM of my native state, she declared the COVID Express. So the migrants were thought to be carrying COVID, and various states did not give them entry. And we saw the plight that occurred in Uttar Pradesh and other parts where they were not being allowed entry because they were thought that they were spreading COVID. And also, there were some local reports, local media reports, that when the migrants reached the village, as Professor Bagchi has rightly pointed out, they made a social ostracism because of this propaganda that they were carriers of COVID and so on and so forth. In one instance in Bakura, they were not allowed to stay in the village, and they had to make some temporary arrangement in a tree. And at that time, a cyclone was coming in West Bengal and Odisha, and that badly affected them. In many of the places, this social ostracism against the migrants was very severe. Means this added an additional problem or additional dimension to them. And as has been the case regarding again the vaccination. Now, I have made some very preliminary survey with my students on vaccination. There also, the migrants had some asymmetric sufferings. The reason is that these vaccination center declared some domicile certificates and so on at the beginning from panchayats, etc., which many of the migrants are missing. So they could not take the vaccine at their village, they could not take the vaccine at their destinations. So the amount of the non-vaccination is higher among the migrant people. So the migrant people, they suffered the loss of their livelihood, and they suffered the vaccination. There was very little vaccination, and also they were socially castigated as if they were some people who are causing harm to everybody. Now, what happened when the migrant returned home? This is also very interesting, aside of that social castigation. Now, my student Ashish Pal is present here. I did a study of some of the gold artisans of Gujarat who returned home after the first lockdown. Now, when they were at Gujarat, whatever they were earning, maybe, it was far greater than what they could expect at their home as an unskilled worker. So there was a loss of livelihood. There was a loss in the lifestyle. And also, they could not find any gainful employment in the village because they said that they are many days away from their home and they lost their skills and all those things.
Okay, but what is the issue, Professor Atanu? Just why not sharpen your issue? What exactly the issue that you're raising that could be very contributory for the entire discussion. You know, these are the examples, supplementary notes can be given later on also. But what is the issue that must really provoke, encourage Professor Bagchi to, respond to you or other people also, other participants. So I think I would request you to just sharpen the issue, concentrate on that and focus on that will be better.
The issues are very clear. Actually, I'm giving these examples just to point it out, some clarify the point. Many a times in a grand narrative, we often lose some of the pains and the pangs which the common people feel. So I am personally not much in favor of any grand narrative. It may be of any type. I mean, that is why I love Professor Bagchi's books and etc. because they present them in a very nice manner without going to any grand narratives. Whatever it may be, still if we consider some of the issues, the first issue is obviously skill formation. That is the important issue. That what type of skills we should give to these migrants, we should provide these migrants so that they have some gainful employment. Another is the identification issue. There was talk about a Aadhaar card and a universal ration card so that they can get, it is not the domicile, it is not something which is fitted at the domicile. Or whether it is possible to engender a type of this universal card or universal ration card or something which they can avail without being pinpointed to any place. Now, again, At the issues come, the problems come. As these issues are raised, as if we really pinpoint that there should be given all those things, the question arises about the watching power of the state and so on and so forth, which we feel all over the world is facing. So naturally, if we want to think of cohesive development or the development, then one thing we must have to admit that migration we cannot prevent, because people will go for migration wherever they will find better job. As I'm giving the example of Bismarck, there is a study that migration out of Germany declared considerably after the health scheme which was declared by Bismarck. Not though USA were giving them higher job, but the cost of health reduced in Germany, and that prevented the outflow of Germans to the to USA before the First World War. That was one finding. Now, so if the basic provisions are provided, can be by the state. Again, we are thinking of state. There is a problem, as Professor Bagchi has said. State is not something which already the Marx has taught us. State is not good for all.
Okay.
So actually, my concern is about. Basically, I pointed out the healthcare because nowadays in the all the media propaganda, it appears that is individual is responsible for this pandemic. Okay, you include your individual awareness, individual distancing. So what should the state then do? Why this pandemic came to my door? Because not all the countries are suffering from Omicron. So why is this situation as a way? So instead of positing the problem on the individual, and also there were some findings we all know that individuals' resistance to this COVID disease depends also on nutrition, which is again a function of economic and social deprivation and so on.
Okay.
So this is my issue. That is,
I think your time is up now. I'm sorry. I'm so happy for the nice question that you have raised. At the last one, you said that individual focused media attention, isn't it? Last point that you're talking about media related to media. Last point that you talked about related to media, on focusing the individual that you're accusing that is the system that is there.
No talk about state and.
It's not the people, not the public, not the poor people. Like, yeah, I remember some film is being made out of the migrant workers. And I read a lot of critics on that. And there's a lot of censorship also. So I think there's a problem. And why it is happening in the media and the government and the power structure. That's what the relationship, all that. But I must thank you so much, Professor Atanu, for having highlighted. In fact, a lot of time is there. Not much of time is there for us to, but we could have heard you more. Professor Bagchi, I think you took the points later on for all the 4 discussions after the points being taken note of. Perhaps you will be able to respond at that time. I think that will be better arrangement, sir, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. So then in that case, shall I request the next person, next discussion? Shall I request Professor Arup Sen? Professor Arup Kumar Sen.
Yeah. So, am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yes.
So, Professor Bagchi has provided a very powerful critique of geopolitics of development, and he also tried to establish close connection between the imperial policy or the so-called civilization mission of the West and wanton violence inflicted on diverse, a large number of people in different parts of the world, particularly in the Middle Eastern countries and Africa and also Central America. So I feel that there is a racial dimension that is embedded in Professor Bagchi's argument, that there is a clear racial dimension to this kind of imperial policy over a long period of time. So what is important in conceptualizing development, I feel what comes to my mind is the development of underdevelopment thesis of the famous Latin American intellectual Andre Gunder Frank. And this thesis was posed sometime in the 1960s of the last century. So Frank argued that we cannot formulate a dependable theory and policy of development without taking into account the social history and social and economic history of this underdevelopment. So if we do not consider this social history and economic history of underdevelopment, so how can we conceptualize a dependable theory of development? So this is very important. So Professor Bagchi has very extensively discussed about the global scene and the migration crisis, and this migration crisis is also connected with these imperial policies. So let me shift the focus to the domestic part of the story, the case of India. So if we revisit the developmental trajectory of India in the post-independence period, so what is celebrated as development, but there is an untold story that if in the past 50 years of the so-called development, it is estimated that 60 million people were uprooted from their soil by the development projects themselves, and which we can call, in a sense, it is some kind of primitive accumulation in the Marxist sense. And this primitive accumulation has intensified in the neoliberal regime that we are going through. And Professor Sunil Ray was talking about what is happening in Chhattisgarh. So this is the same story being repeated in Jharkhand, Odisha, and other tribal regions. So in the name of development, large-scale displacement of people as well as violence is inflicted on people, and those people mostly belong to the tribal community and the Dalits. So there is a clear class and community dimension to this victimhood of violence. So now the question comes that time has come to interrogate the dominant paradigm of development being floated in the administrative discourse as well as in the media. So the agriculture is treated as a very backward sector, and the journey from agriculture to the industry and service sector is treated as a story of development. But this is highly questionable. If we feel that the recent crisis in India in the post-COVID period, in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, so we find that the statistics tell a different story, that it is estimated that between 2018-19 and 2019-20, during this period of the additional jobs created in the Indian economy, more than 70% were, that comes to around more than 30 million jobs were created in the agriculture sector. On the other hand, only 5% jobs were created in the so-called manufacturing and construction sector. So this is very important in reimagining development. And because you know that the large-scale displacement, the large-scale displacement that took place in the 50 years of development, so those people, many of those people became part of the footloose labor under neoliberalism. And who are the migrants, and who during the COVID-19, the kind of migrant crisis that we witnessed, that large number of people are leaving the cities and going back to their villages. So in the coming days, there is little possibility that jobs will be created to get back their jobs in the urban sectors. So what is the way out? I feel that there is a possibility of rethinking development in terms of reviving agriculture. And in this context, the success story of Cuba comes to my mind. Actually, in the late 80s, after the collapse of Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries, the Cuba faced a major crisis because Cuba was dependent for trade as well as other inputs on the Soviet bloc countries. So what did Cuba do to take care of it? So the Cuba radically changed this paradigm of development, and the revived agriculture in a completely different sense, which we call the agroecological revolution in Cuba. And this
you tell us how do you think about this agricultural reorganization of agriculture that could be, and it's very interesting element of change in a new paradigm that you think about. Just why don't you just explain and how do you conceive agriculture could be an important cog in the wheel for development?
I'm just reflecting on that. What Cuba did, that they revived agriculture by integrating the peasant knowledge of agriculture and combined that with the result of the agro science research in Cuba, and they were disseminated to the rural level through the school education, and it is a combination of expert knowledge and traditional peasant knowledge, and they did it through the cooperatives. So there is a connection between this revival of agriculture for development as well as decentralized strategy, because previously, before the 1989 crisis, the 75 to 80% of the agricultural land were concentrated in state farms. But what happened because of this agricultural revolution, that only 40% land were in state hands, and the rest were encouraged to be converted into cooperatives, and the cooperatives were run on very democratic principles, because the ordinary members of the cooperative has the last say on the kind of development that will take place in their domain. So I feel that Cuban, I'm not suggesting that India should go the Cuban way. So because whether there is a lot of debate that whether the Chinese road to socialism or the Soviet road to socialism, that were old debates. But we should reconceptualize development in the present context where the neoliberal onslaught is taking place on Indian soil. So this is my broad point, that reimagining development in terms of revival of agriculture and agro-based industries, and questioning the dominant paradigm of development which celebrates large-scale industrialization. And we know the recent farmers' protest in India amply testifies that agriculture is still important, because so many people depend on their livelihood for agriculture, and the kind of questioning that they took of the farm laws regarding the corporatization of agriculture, that is a relevant pointer in mobilizing solidarities as well as reimagining development. So I would like to stop here.
Okay. So in that case, in agriculture, in agriculture, you suggest that hello. Okay. Yes.
Can you hear
Dr.
me?
Arup.
Yeah.
So agriculture, that you suggest that, well, in the cooperative form, and land ownership, private land ownership should be abolished in that case, in the pulling the lands together and then doing it, isn't it? That is what you are precisely talking about.
Yeah, because I am not suggesting it in a very crude sense, because if private ownership cannot be given farewell in an agrarian society like ours, because the collectivization debate will come in that context, whether it will be a forceful takeover of land. I am not suggesting that, but I think that cooperative has enormous possibilities.
That's okay. I understood now. That is a very interesting point that you're making. Actually, the kind of suggestion, they're very cryptic and very pointed. I must say that is a very interesting contribution that you're making for the new paradigm, and how do you really tackle this question? Question of inequality, question of discrimination, question of there's not only the 40%. I mean, 1/3 of the population were vulnerable. How do we eliminate the vulnerability of the 1/3 of the population of a country like India? Who are always. So anyway, these are very interesting things that you talked about, and thank you so much, Dr. Arup.
Thank you.
Then may I now request Dr. Mansee to contribute? to this discussion.
Thank you, Professor Ray. Thanks for moderating it so well. And it is a great honor to share the platform with Professor Bagchi. And I'm meeting him for the first time, meeting him, to be honest. And thanks, Arjun, for having me here. I will start with a very strong line which Professor Bagchi has already defined cohesive development and take it to the point of climate change. And the three main pointers which he talks about is health, education, and cognitive development, where people have opportunities of doing the kind of things they would like to do. Ironically, if I bring in the capitalism or imperialism perspective into these pointers, we actually deviate from the very point of cohesive development, which Professor Bagchi also talks about it, that it also means that human beings should respect the boundaries of nature, which they cross at their own peril and the peril of other living beings on earth. And I think this is where we should be able to start linking how imperialism and climate change have been actually so closely in a vicious cycle, or I would rather say nexus to that extent. And inequality is at the root cause of it. You know, and if you look at the literature of United Nations and OECD, who are trying to moderate between the countries, and also we saw how horrible the COP26 discussions went on and ended with almost no decisions on these things, that how developing countries and developed countries have these economies or dynamics between migration and the impact on climate change. If I look at these points and look at the way India is dealing with migration, both out migration and in migration, and what does that mean to climate change? What is interesting here is that we are producing in excess and exporting both human resources as well as our food, all kind of water resources indirectly and all, to the imperialist nations or the Western countries, so to say. At the same time, in the country, we are actually receiving impoverished people, uneducated human resources. So it is a double whammy, I must say, in our country's point of view, that we are at a double loss in terms of migration, and if I link it with climate change. Because the out migration is at a larger scale, and it is loss from both ends, from the natural resources, human capital, and the in-migration is actually giving us more losses from both ways, because the consumption is increasing. We have more hands and mouths to consume than we have to actually produce for the West. So here also comes the humanitarian side of it. And we have been one of the generous countries in the world as far as migration is concerned. Unfortunately, not in the recent time with the rising problems. We are unfortunately trying to also copy the West in terms of our own narrative of imperialism. And at the same time, if I am looking at last 2-3 decades of degradation of environment in the guise of development, that is also an alarming situation. And when I hear all the experts from India also talking in COP26, it gives me more shivers. Because if we are blaming the West of their doing wrong, and if we want to use that as our license to do wrong, and I would like to bring Professor Vijay Parshad's point here, when he was trying to defend why India still has can do a lot of things because the West is still doing. I think this is where we have to really put a check for us. I'm not going to talk about the problems which are around us, because we all have problems, and all the countries have these problems. I would like to really bring few points for future directions, because the youth wants to get some hope of what we are doing and what our generation and senior generations are doing. Because what we are going to do today is going to impact tomorrow. It's not about that we have to plan for tomorrow, but we have to also think about what we are going to do today. And I was just interested to really bring a line from Marx, because we have been talking around his way of thinking and critiquing capitalism, and try to link with Professor Bagchi's work. Interestingly, if Marx was here today, in this era of climate change and talking about inequality, because we are seeing inequality as a other side of cohesive development, which probably may not be that linear. But if I have to really look at his work and see how he dwelled into talking about capitalism, and he was not talking from the Anthropocene side only, very much like Professor Bagchi also talked about, that humans have to know their boundaries of the nature. Given this situation, and keeping aside all the problems we are facing from climate change, and inequality is at the core of climate change discourse, apart from the environmental degradation, where do we go from here? And this is where I have very simple, naive, layperson questions for Professor Bagchi. And with those questions, probably I will stop my points. Because he is also talking about underdevelopment in his work, and I also saw, Professor Ray, your work also touches upon these aspects of underdevelopment. I would like to propose here the idea of de-development, because this whole climate change distress is out of the very discourse of development, that we want to develop and we want to reach somewhere. If I have to talk about India, let's say that we want to become something like, I don't know what, Hong Kong, Singapore, New York, Manhattan, you name it, Paris, London. We are trying to become like that. Are they climatic? Are they sustainable even from the climate change perspective? Are we checking those standards? Do we have climate change index to check whether they are really adhering to climate change indexes, and so that we can follow them as a panacea, which we should not, but somewhere we have to really question that point. So if we are talking about development per se, and if you, both of you, Professor Ray and Professor Bagchi, you have already coined the idea of underdevelopment, I want to bring in the idea of de-development here, because the whole development discourse is actually deviating from the climate change point.
You mean to say redevelopment?
De-development.
Redevelopment.
No, DE. It is already
de-development.
Yes,
Okay,
it
fine.
is already in the.
Very good.
It is already going in the climate change discourse, in the commons discourse, where we are talking about. Let's not get into the development discourse and talk about de-development. And I'm going to bring some examples. De-damming has started. I just read a day before yesterday that Canada is also getting very, very aggressive in going de-damming. Scandinavia's countries are going de-damming. Japan has already started doing it, Italy, and you can just start naming US and all. If we have to undo a lot of things, because we are talking futuristic for our younger generation, and we have to face the climate change, I would like to really see climate change as an opportunity to talk about de-development and start undoing it. Because if we continue doing what the West has done, and despite knowing that they have destroyed not only the economy, not only the social fabric in terms of equality or inequality, they've also actually laid the path for all the developing countries, particularly South Asia and Middle East countries, to follow them and also, distress the climate change point. But here comes the silver lining, that because climate change is not region specific, can climate change become a binder or a connector to really start talking about it? We were all very hopeful in COP26 that climate change will come, discourse will bring some kind of silver linings, which has not, but maybe we have to restart.
Dr. Mansee, why not just focus on what exactly, how do you conceptualize de-development?
Undoing it. So I'm going to define de-development here, but I just wanted to make a point that climate change has to become now a connector and also somewhere a stabilizer of this imperialism way of looking at things. So how do we do that? If I have to really, I'm not an expert of international issues, I will focus only on the country-specific issues. Why are we racing for more development, more economy, when the human growth, the human development index is reducing? And unfortunately, even if we are racing for development, our economy is also going down the drains. So why not really start talking about things where local people, and you gave the example of Chhattisgarh, why not we change the governance system itself and find out some way of polycentricity, not really making a monolithic way of centralized. Unfortunately, in the country, we are going towards a monolithic way of governance. And I'm talking about completely other way of going towards decentralizing and really taking I mean, I can't say this in the official platform here, but most of the indigenous communities, the government is almost declaring them as anti-nationals, declaring them as not good for the development and all. I think this is where we have gone wrong in last 50 years, 70 years, I must say.
Okay.
So the empowering of the indigenous community is at the core of really resolving the environmental degradation. So I mean, I think as learned or so-called educated people like us, we are also responsible somewhere to make this divide between government and the indigenous people, because the way we project them. So if we really want to address climate change and also reduce the migration, urban migration or international migration and all, I think we have to go back to the roots and start talking about bottom-up governance, if not possible, but at least polycentric governance, where they're representative of the local people, including all kinds of Northeast, unrest, Chhattisgarh unrest, Jharkhand unrest, all kinds of tribal unrest are also. They are the real caretakers of the natural resources. I think urbanites have forgotten how to take care of the natural resources. So we have to at least give them the power to take care of what we at least have now, to save it, if not degrade it further. So I will stop here, but I want to discuss more on de-development as an idea with Professor Bagchi, and that's where I meant that we have to go back there. And we have to undo a lot of wrong things. We don't need 20-lane expressways in the country. It is just a misleading idea of economic development. By making all these DMIC corridors, by making another nuclear plant, we are not heading anywhere. Can we redistribute the money or the funds to the grassroots, to the indigenous people? I think that is where we have more answers, because we cannot solve climate change. And again, I think I was happy with Professor Sengupta's point here. The larger narratives cannot solve climate change, cannot solve migration, cannot solve human growth. Human growth is a grain issue. It is not an aggregate issue. So that will only come from the bottom up. So I will pitch for de-development as an idea. Thank you so much, Professor Ray, for this opportunity. And I wait to hear from Professor Bagchi on it.
Thank you so much, Mansee. Dr. Mansee, so nice. Number of issues that you raised was very enlightening and quite stimulating. We will take it later. Professor Bagchi will be able to respond later on. Now, may I request Dr. Gopal Krishna? Dr. Gopal. Yes. So you are here. I mean, finally.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Gopal.
I will focus on the latter part of Professor Bagchi's talk today. I will be, first of all, I would like to recollect one of the writings which Professor Bagchi wrote several years back in Frontline. In Frontline, Professor Bagchi wrote a three-part article after Nobel Prize was awarded to Professor Amartya Sen. And I remember a sentence from that article where Professor Bagchi underlined that the Nobel Prize given to Amartya Sen was a break from a two-decade-old trend where only they were favored, who favored private property, who favored free markets. We said this focus on human freedom, focus on human capability was a welcome change. But in recent years, he may not agree with whether the new Nobel laureates also fall in the same category. But focusing on the presentation and the talk which Professor Bagchi gave today, I will make very small 10 points. which I was framing while I was listening to him. I get a sense, I have read Professor Bagchi, some of his writings, that I get a sense that the outrage which was inherent in his observation, in his talk, was that human beings are moral beings and migrants are human beings and they are also moral beings. So if they are human beings, and we know that they are human beings, they cannot be treated as subhumans. This tendency of treating human beings as subhumans by Westphalian states is deeply immoral. It is quite unethical. And in one of his papers, I recollect that the very opening line of Professor Bagchi was engaging with the question of morality in migration. And therefore, I think it's a very important thing which is missing in the discourse in general. So human beings are migratory animals. I understand from the talk and the writings of Professor Bagchi. And like other animals, human beings also have a sense of territoriality. And that sense of territoriality was not very abnormal as long as those territorial boundaries were not fixed, not very rigid. But when the Westphalian state came into being, the territoriality became abnormally fixed and rigid. And that has created many problems, and the rights of migrants have been compromised because of that. Migrants are human beings, and therefore the way any civilized organization ought to deal with them is to deal with them as an equal human being. But the Westphalian state treats only its citizens, although it can be debated whether in recent times, in the case of neoliberal state, whether that is also true. But in general, the Westphalian state treats only its own citizens as human beings and not the non-citizens as human beings, or also those citizens as human beings which it approves to be the carriers of right kinds of ideas, right kinds of skin color, right kinds of religion. If they uphold those things, they are considered as citizens, and because they are considered citizens, officially citizens, they are human beings, and all the others are subhumans, it appears. So the point which Professor Bagchi makes, and in fact, although he said it in a professorial, in an academic way, but the underlying between the lines, one can sense the outrage which he is expressing with regard to the inhumanity and the cruelty which fellow human beings are subjected in Europe and US, and also with regard to internal migrants within the country, especially in the wake of pandemic. The Westphalian state runs away or evaporates in the face of disasters, creating refugees and stateless migrants. Or sometimes the state and the public institutions of the state, they pretend to be surprised. The fact is that they engineer migration. Their structural intervention creates abnormal migration. The migrant issue raises the issue of equality, morality, justice, fairness, one human being being equal to every other human being. Under no circumstances they can be treated as subhumans. Just because somebody is a non-citizen or somebody is not of the same party, which happens to be a ruling party, that does not make human beings non-humans or subhumans.
Right.
So the jurisprudential and legal imagination, which is at present enveloping us, does not inspire action as to how a state should treat people whose status as citizens or residents across several territorial jurisdictions are in question. The jurisprudential imagination ought to engage with or inspire states which or public institutions to ensure that human beings are treated in the framework of equality, morality, and justice and fairness. On the issue of, and this is I'm drawing from Professor Bagchi's writings, that he has noted that like finance-led globalization finance-led globalization led to huge migration. In the same way, the neoliberal policies are causing huge amounts of massive amount of migration, internal migration as well as internal migration. And these policies are limiting the state's function with to only providing security to the rich elite class and to the transnational corporations. Their protection of their property becomes the sole concern. Evidently, it is emerging. The new laws, although because of farmer protests they have been taken back, it emerges that it was aimed at protecting the interest of the rich and the transnational agri-businesses. The journey of the indentured labor to the current swell of migration shows that intervention of corporation and the state is engineering displacement and uprooting. It is the state and the corporations which are engineering migration. And one issue which Professor Bagchi mentioned in passing, but it requires greater attention, is that undocumented migrants, undocumented human beings, they are being treated as subhumans. This is outrageous. A paper citizen, a paper human being, how can be more credible than a living human being? Documenting the undocumented through automatic identification and biometric technologies and electronic technologies is also about profiling of human beings with wrong skin pigmentation, wrong religion, or wrong regions, or carriers of officially deemed wrong ideas. So I think this is not innocent. This documentation process which is happening through Aadhaar or through National Population Register or in the name of Citizens Amendment Act CAA, which Professor Bagchi referred to, both Aadhaar, which is a brand name for 12-digit unique identification number, is a biometric determinism. This is akin to genetic determinism. This is akin to legitimizing eugenic thinking, which is long discredited. So therefore, any observation or any considered opinion on documenting electronic profiling, biometric profiling, genetic profiling of migrants in particular or residents in general is actually inexcusable and indefensible. It has been abandoned, rightly abandoned in UK after the recommendation of London School of Economics. There such programs and schemes have been abandoned. And such profiling will lead to genocide, which IBM contributed to in Germany in 1930s, where the Nazi party managed to get the census data of the Jews. So I think Giorgio Agamben is right when he says that all this biometric profiling which is happening in a specific context, they will ultimately lead to concentration camp regime which is unfolding towards the end. And my last point is that there was an observation with regard to Anthropocene, and I think this is we need to rigorously interrogate this term, because this creates a potential for the corporations and businesses to hide behind past human beings, present human beings, and future human beings. It is not Anthropocene. This is Corpocene. The corporations are not, innocent institutional technologies. They need to be interrogated. Their very conception needs to be interrogated. And I always agree with the point which Professor Ray has made in his recent writings about alternative paradigm of development. I said an alternative paradigm for well-being for human beings and other species and planetary peace is required. Their alternative organization is required. Naturalization and normalization of the unnatural and abnormal externalization of environmental and human cost and the negative externality internalized in the modern economics is indefensible. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Gopal. It's very, very interesting some points that you raised and all. I really thank all of you so much for your very important contributions. May I request Professor Bagchi, or shall I ask anybody any participant apart from the discussion, any other participant is there who would like to raise some questions and all that, or later on that can be done. First of all, the discussion can be taken up and Professor Bagchi can respond to them. May I request Professor Bagchi to respond to all the discussions point?
First of all, let me thank all the discussions. I'm so glad to see that all of them are really interested in the welfare of human beings and not just in increasing power, economic power, and so on. And all of them have raised very relevant issues. In order to reply to them, let me try and create a kind of envelope. First of all, we have to recognize that the whole world except Cuba is now ruled by capitalists, or as Sunil would like to say, capital. And the political economy of that is that capitalists have one primary motive, as Marx said, accumulate, that is Moses and all the prophets. And that drives capitalists in all the countries in the world, including our country. So in order to really have a different world, we have to dislodge the power of the capitalists and the power of the people who collaborate with them. In our country, one of the greatest mistakes that we made after independence is not to abolish landlordism. There are no land reforms in this country, except in Jammu and Kashmir, except in West Bengal in a very partial manner, and in Kerala. And it is the alliance between the landlords and the capitalists that has ruled this country. And the landlords never wanted their agricultural laborers or the peasants under their control to have any freedom. I'll give you two examples. At a time when I can't remember who was the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, I was then working for the history of the State Bank of India. And the State Bank of India had the government had a scheme of giving some, under IRDP scheme, some loans to agricultural laborers, small peasants, for buying goats and other kinds of things in order to increase their income. And in Uttar Pradesh, the scheme was not being implemented. Ultimately, the general manager of the State Bank of India there met the chief minister. Said, sir, this is not being implemented. He said, well, if we give the loans to these characters, they will not work for us. Why should we give them? That's only a tiny example. You have read my late friend Pradhan Harishankar Prasad's work on the what happened to the irrigation projects in Bihar, in the Son project. The landlords would not allow the irrigation water to come to the lands of the tenants, because in that case, the interest that they get from the loans, which all the time mount, will be lower than the increase in income that they expect. So the irrigation projects were not really fully implemented until after a long time. And the continued dominance of particularly the upper castes in most parts of India also percolated into the ideology. The ideology which protected the caste system, as the current ruling party protects it. It completely believes in the monosynthesis. It also percolated in the treatment of women. At one time, the South India was quite different from North India in the treatment of women. And the sex ratio was much better in southern Indian states than here. But in Karnataka, where the ruling party has been ruling for quite some time, the sex ratio has plummeted from 2016 to 2019-20. It has now become almost as low as in Haryana and Punjab. And this has been the effect of the ideology that has been propagated by the Hindutvawalas, and also which has been naturalized by many in the breasts of many upper caste people. So the point is that unless we also address this question of who rules the country and how to dislodge them, and how to get rid of the completely dehumanizing ideology which was propagated by Manusmriti. There are great other thinkers in India like Gautam Buddha. In the Upanishads also, there are also many bits of writings which are still valuable. For example, Sarno Bhuvuktu, Sarno Korabami, the kind of slogan that Rabindranath Tagore introduced in Shantiniketan, that we will all work together and we'll all enjoy together. These are also there, but the dominant system became the caste system. There are revolts against that system throughout history, from the time of, before in fact, Gautama Buddha or Mahavira, and down to the Bhakti saints and so on. There are great poems written by the Sangam poets in Tamil Nadu, by the Bhakti tradition in Bengal, in Assam, by followers of Shankaradev and Sri Chaitanya and Lalan Shah. But that did not percolate to the general population. They remained confined to the marginalized people, and the upper caste saw to it that the lower castes and the poorer people remained uneducated, so that they do not get hold of these documents. So my first proposition is that one has to think about how to change the whole, not only the whole political system, but also the social system, how to change the mindset of the people. And one of the basic requirements is that the state must be very active in that. The state, not just as a centralized entity, but as Dr. Mansee Bhargava has suggested, as a decentralized entity. That I come to Professor Atanu Sengupta's point. Yes, public health is extremely important, and public health is something that should be public. There are 2 or 3 things that cannot be, even in a capitalist society, left to the private sector. You know that Cuba has a lower infant mortality and under 5 mortality rate than the United States, whereas Cuba's income is probably not even 1/10 of that of the United States. And among the capitalist countries also, the United States does much worse in terms of longevity, in terms of infant mortality, than a country like Canada with a lower income, than a country like France or Germany. And that is because in Canada, France or Germany, there is still, or Netherlands, there's still a working healthcare system. So the point is that in order to really get health to the ordinary people, we cannot depend at all on private hospitals. And in our country, what has happened that the proportion of money spent on health by not only the central government, but most state governments has remained extremely low. Whether you take West Bengal or you take Bihar, Bihar does extremely badly, not because Bihar does not have resources, but because all the time Bihar has been unable to get rid of the upper caste landlords. And while we talk about the progress that India has made in economic terms, and sometimes it is claimed that we are simply going to be the next to China in a few years because of our economic growth. That is not going to happen because economic growth has already declined. In hunger index, India does even worse than most of the sub-Saharan countries. Now, again, in order to get there, as Dr. Gopal Krishna suggested, or was it somebody else, that we should have a universal public distribution system, a universal ration card, a universal identity for everybody, and we should not really profile anybody. And that I totally agree. And while I agree entirely with Arup about the need for an ecological revolution, we cannot simply depend on agriculture for that. For simply reason that even in Cuba, if you look at it, the proportion of employment provided by agriculture is not the majority. It is doctors, it is educators, it is the distinction of being a small country, but having produced vaccines for hepatitis a long time back. It is the only small country which has produced a vaccine of its own against COVID-19. And this has all been the result of the high standard of medical education in Cuba. Again, I recall a conversation with a woman doctor, a young woman doctor in New York when I was working for the UN Journal of Development Planning. She was trained in fact, many of the Black Americans at one time went to Cuba in order to get trained there in medicine. And she was trained there, and she had the opportunity of coming back and working in the States. I said, you earn much less. She said, no, but at the same time, I have much greater satisfaction from the work that I do there. Some of you may have seen the film of Michael Moore, where he took the victims of the 9/11 attack, not the victims, but the people who were, in fact, trying to rescue the people in that building, but were not treated properly medically in the United States. He took them to Cuba in order to get treated. So Cuba is a model in terms of education, in terms of healthcare. What Cuba did after the Soviet collapse is that earlier on, Cuba had state farms which are primarily devoted to the production of sugar, which was bought by the Soviet bloc countries. With that gone, what they did was to diversify their agriculture and ordinary peasants more incentive to work on their own. And therefore, as Arup said, they created a large number of cooperatives there. Now, in our country, there was a team which visited during the China in around 1957, and they came back and the cooperatives for Indian to organize the cooperatives, because without land reforms, you cannot really organize cooperatives. And in the cooperatives also, you must have a proper incentive system. China, before it became a predatory capitalist country, when it began its reforms, did the right thing in introducing the responsibility system there. So, yeah. Lot of stuff in the utopia that I think not for, but also the rest of the world, because they are also our brethren. We have suffering people in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in France, everywhere. And so it is for them also that I think that what we should do is to de-develop in the sense that profit should not be the primary motive of final growth. We can get there because of some demographic changes that have already taken place. In many countries of the world, particularly in Europe, in Japan, in China now, the rate of population growth is much below the replacement level. So population is shrinking and their real needs are going down. What we need to do is to serve this smaller population with the kinds of things they need. They need proper nutrition. They need tasteful food. You cannot always give them the rations that are recommended by doctors. I mean, you know, given the choice between, let us say, tasty chow mein and just let us say ordinary gruel and rice, who would not choose chow mein? So the people must have choice also in consumption habits. They must have choice in other areas. But all this must be done primarily by using renewable energy. There is enormous scope for renewable energy in this world. I have already presented a paper in an earlier degrowth session on this. And this possibility is increasing all the time. Newer and newer technologies are being invented. Instead of lithium-ion batteries, we now have hydrogen-ion batteries, and other technologies are being invented. Already in Canada, there is aircraft which has been flown, which has flown on electricity, and now electric cars will be there all around the world. Sweden has invented green steel, so we can now have steel without using carbon. So the carbon footprint also can be lowered there. I won't go into all the details. There are also microalgal technologies because I am not a technologist. But in India, in the United States, in every country of the world, there's enormous possibility for replacing the fossil fuels by renewable energy of solar power, water power, tidal power, wind power, and so on. We should use those kinds of things to have public control of practically all renewable energy resources, not giving them over to Reliance or Adani. And there should be decentralized control of these. There's already under the left-hand government with Dr. Chaudhary in charge, in Sundarbans, in small islands that introduced solar power. And that can be done on a small scale in all communities in India. But for all that, again, as what is a change in not only the political setup, but also a change in the ideological setup, in the social setup. And as Dr. Bhargava said, Adivasi most blatant victims of all this so-called development, and the protection of Adivasis should be one of the primary goals of whatever we do. Under the UPA government, there is a good forest law which said that you cannot displace any forest dweller without providing proper habitat and without replanting the trees. But the current government has not disregarded that law, but also has amended it so as to permit corporate sector to exploit that. So with the kind of dispensation that we have, and we are likely to have, even with the Congress coming to power, you cannot really change the basic structure of society or the basic ideology of the country. It's a long haul, but you are young. All of the people who are elected are young, and you have a long future to work for that. So I'm hoping that you'll work towards changing the political structure, social structure, the economic structure, and the ways of thinking of ordinary people by educating them, by giving them proper health care. As far as cognitive development is concerned, see, one of the points made by many of the white men against the blacks, who are often descendants of slaves, that they did not have enough intelligence. How could they have? They are often born to underfed mothers. They are born underweight, and they are not properly nourished. And people do not gain any cognitive ability after if they are undernourished until the age of 4. And this is true also of people in our country. So it is these basic things that must be provided to the ordinary people, and the products will come from renewable energy sources, and the governance will be decentralized as far as possible. My recommendation.
Are you through, sir?
Yes, I do not want to elaborate because this is an utopia, and the utopia can be made into a book, as Thomas More and Ursula Le Guin has often done in her science fiction books.
Okay. Thank you so much. I know it's very nicely being responded each and every issue, and then it's quite expansive also at the same time. Anybody, any other participant who would be interested to raise any question or issue or supplement anything? Is there anybody? Dr. Arjun?
Sir, there is a question which has come.
Yeah,
That is
go
why
ahead.
Dr. Bamadev Sigdalji, Pranam Professor Bagchi, we enriched much more from your lecture at the cost of our human resource and haphazard exploit our South resources in the past. Most of the Western countries developed. How do you respond on it? How we have to utilize our labor force so that we can obtain sustainable development in South Asia? So more of a North-South developing and developed countries debate. Sir, how do you see that cohesion happening as we go forward?
Well, there are countries which have done on their own quite well. China is a leading example. China was also horribly exploited by the Western powers. Although China was not formally occupied, it was devastated by several wars in the 19th century. Two opium wars, by the wars by the Taichungs, and later on the Boxer War, the attack by the Japanese. At the time that China became a communist country in 1949, China's output was less than that of India, and per capita income was less than that of India. And now look at China. China's economy is now the second largest in the world. China's people have a much larger longevity than India's. China is at the technological frontier of the world. They are in fact competing with the United States in not only the cyber technology areas, but also in outer space. They have in fact created a space station of their own. They have landed on the black side of the moon, and they're going further in that. And the United States and NATO powers are quite scared of the growing power of China. We had even better because at the time of independence, we had a much better educated workforce. We had great scientists among them, like Meghnad Saha. C.V. Raman was still alive. Meghnad Saha, Vikram Sarabhai, S.S. Bhatnagar, and several others. We did not utilize them because they were incapable of doing that under the kind of political economy that was created in 1947. So it is not a question. Sure, the Western countries had exploited us, but we could have got out of it easily. There are two other countries. One is a country and another is an island, South Korea and Taiwan. Certainly, they got military aid from the United States when they are coming up, but they utilized that aid. Philippines also was given a lot of aid by the United States, but they did not it did not come up because it was ruled by the landlords. But in South Korea and Taiwan, they got rid of the landlords, and then they are now so developed that South Korea is now a member of the OECD, and Taiwan's per capita income and Singapore's per capita incomes are greater in some cases than that of many European countries. So I think It is not a question of simply reliving the experience of exploitation by the Westerners, but being self-reliant and going ahead on our own.
Okay. Anybody? Any other question? Dr. Simi, I could see your photo.
No, sir. Thank
Yes.
you. I don't. Good afternoon. So I don't have any question per se. So I was just looking forward to concluding the program. But please, over to you.
To me?
Yes, sir.
You want me to conclude now?
Yes, sir. You can take it forward as you wish.
You're feeling tired, is it?
No, no, no.
I
Not
wanted
at all.
to
It
hear
has
more.
been so enriching, sir. It has been a true honor. Yes, sir.
So anyway, how do I conclude? I do not know. It's such a very interesting ending. You feel like hearing more and more Professor Bagchi, his perspective and understanding of the global scenario, the global politics and economy, at the same time the Indian economy and society. Something very deep, but something he has shared with us quite a bit, and very challenging. But the whole, coming back to conclude, what is that I should say, that back to what I was speaking in the beginning, is that it's just migration crisis he talked about. This is my perception, my understanding. But migration crisis is a problem, definitely is a crisis, and it's a human problem. What Gopal was talking about, humanity. It's a human problem, whether it's in India and Mexico or any other country, that's fine. But much more important, what Professor Bagchi wanted us to concentrate, or implicit in his understanding, in his presentation, is that, or rather he has explained also, why such migration crisis occurs. That is something which we need to concentrate on. We need to know, if you want to prescribe a solution, you need to know why such problem has occurred. Now, media's focus, and the media of the most dominant, powerful people, they focuses on migration as a problem. Definitely, it's a problem. They want the people to confine their attention to the migration issue. They never want to go beyond it, but why such migration takes place. It is precisely here Professor Bagchi has brought it out very clearly. So why such migration at the international level? Not to talk about the national at the moment. The why such migration is basically, the motive is nothing but exploitation of the resources, exploitation of the people, and different ways, whether by what coddling, whether by force of the military power, this, that, and all that. That has been happening. It's not today, for last 2 decades. This has been the story even earlier, but the story was a different shape, in a different way altogether. Now this has changed quite a bit. So this is the kind of design, a conspiratorial design being made by what is called the international powerful people. And when you see the national government, they need an alliance for whatever the reason that you must know. And therefore they say that yes to yes, no to no. They never know how to antagonize. That is what has been the story all over. It's very clearly spoken, clearly shown. Now, when it comes to Indian situation, you see the migration, yes, that's story. We have heard number of presentations of the migration stories. Now, there are very few, 1 or 2 presentations up there that talk about why such migrations take place. Who are the people speaking about the structural deficiency? Who are the people talking about structural unemployment? Who are the people talking about the structural poverty? Very few. It's the structure. Tomorrow there is another kind of a problem. Natural calamity, for example, huge natural calamity. Who become the first victim? Look at the study of tsunami, Oxfam study. And who are the people first victim? It is the most vulnerable people who become the victim first. And the structure is being oriented this way, whether you talk about caste structure, whether it's a social structure, talk about, or the economic structure, what is the political structure. And all this structure being dominated by what is called the power-centric. Where if it comes to the international, it is the powerful people. Dr. Mansee was talking about what's called, very importantly, this ecological climate change and de-development. I really like this point. The point is that, yes, resource extraction. And there are studies that establish the fact that 90% of the climate, what is called the CO2 emission, is responsible for the 6 countries of the world. And the more historical that everybody talks about, I don't want to elaborate on that point. Now, the question is that you do have resource unequal distribution. You do have, even there are many other things to dismantle. Like, for example, Kyoto Protocol was there in 2012. Some sort of a terms and conditions were imposed by everybody, equally distributed. Attempt was made. America destroyed it. And after the Copenhagen, America came and destroyed it. One after another, you have in the Paris, and then even the lesser CO2. What is this CO26? COP26? Yes, you know the story. We know the fate and why it happened to that. They will never know. Because as Professor Bagchi was talking about, the main mantra is that accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. Is a capital. Is a capital. Who capture which market? Which market has the most share? And you have to enter there. Whether it is a Congo or India or what is called or Equator. Equator has become barren. You know why? Because Equator was asked to supply all the raw material-based, resource-based, natural resource-based products to the other countries of the world, the developed countries of the world. So kind of a trade was patterned in a way that they export it in the name of development to earn the foreign exchange. But in the process, the entire ecological disaster has taken place. There are huge studies on that. Now, why does it happen? Now, this is the story which everybody knows, many of us knows about it. Now, the question is here, which Professor Bagchi has touched upon, and some of you have all talked about how to get out of it. Now, how to get out of it is something, one way of that within the same metabolism of capitalism, you try to find out some way out. You do universalize what healthcare facilities, you do universalize the other public sector proper efficient functioning. These are the things which have been there. Now tell me, these are the suggestions which are there even yesterday also, even few years ago also. It has to be done, it has to be, and it has to be, nothing's been done. I was doing an evaluation of what is called, Food Security Act on 6 states. Just imagine, can you imagine? Even when the food is getting distributed to the poor people, they do not know who the poor are. This is, I'm telling on record. Can you imagine? This is the story, even today. What is that we are going to do now? Now, only way out. Then what is the way out? How to go about it? That is one question which is not being talked too much about it and all that. That's something which is very important for us to take note of. Now, it is good that we have been narrating. It is good that we are explaining. It's good that we are analyzing the situation. But how to change the scenario, how to bring about a change, that is something where we need to concentrate more and more. It is precisely where that we work together. Even Professor Bagchi also was there with us and some of us. And cohesive development is something which we found. And the basic mantra, basic principle of cohesive development is solidarity. Is solidarity at different levels. A solidarity between all the developing countries of the world together. Have a common voice, fight against this kind of thing. That has been happening. There are many stories that say that, well, if you do have the conflict of the 2 nations, there is who is gaining? It is the defense apparatus or defense cell of the defense parts, particle, rifle, and all kinds of weapons. Weapon market. Let there be a fight between India and Pakistan. There will be a weapon market for the American and some companies of the world. Let there be a fight with some other countries together. And there will be a weapon market for some companies of the world. Let the people fight with each other. That has been the story. It's not today I'm talking about, it has been the story forever. Now, you need to bring about a change. How do you go about it? Here I am talking about the solidarity between the people together. It is solidarity of the third world countries together, the deprived. That is what I call the cohesive development here. The regional level, at the local level, at the international level. If you see the power structure, which has been operating everywhere at the dictate of the capital, and they mediate the capital, mediate the interest to the dominant political power, political party in power. It is the power structure of that one. It needs to be dismantled at any cost. Maybe it's going to be there at some stage or the other. But unless and until that is being addressed systematically, theoretically, and also convincingly, as Professor Bagchi was talking about, people have to be educated, people have to learn, know, and they also unlearn and see what should be done and all that. That is how it should go about. So it is this solidarity between the people and solidarity between people and nature, to reflect on Mansee's point. People and nature, you need to know how to respect the nature. Well, we need to know, everybody knows that you need to know, but never happens. If that would have happened, CO2 26, COP 26 would not have failed. Copenhagen would not have failed. And they will not allow that to succeed just because the fact that you have something in design. They'll never allow that to happen. And therefore, the question is that it is the solidarity that has to be really, has to be there between the human beings, the deprived people altogether, whether you talk of the deprived caste, socially deprived, so religiously discriminated, deprived people, economically deprived, women being deprived, politically deprived, at the regional level, similar to the deprived countries of the world together have to have a common voice to fight against this kind of a power structure which is dominating and being mediated to the capital, to the political system by the capital. This is what exactly this discourse is all about. But this is what my conclusion, well, this is my understanding. It may not, one may not agree or agree, but that is something very different. But I must say that every one of you have really tried to contribute, did contribute considerably well. But that if the time would have permitted, we would have learned much more from every one of you very significantly. And of course, Professor Bagchi, perhaps personally, I learned quite a bit about this international dynamics, the way things have been happening and all that. And it's a hugely learning process for every one of us. I thank him profusely for all that he has spoken today to enlighten us. I thank every one of you, Dr. Atanu, Professor Atanu Sengupta, then Gopal Krishna, Mansee, and of course, Dr. Arup Sen, all of you. I thank you all so much to be here with us, to contribute, and hope again we'll be meeting sometimes later at some stage. Thank you so much. I thank again, IMPRI, Dr. Arjun, to have given this opportunity to be with them, and to all of you. Thank you so much. Dr. Arjun.
Thank you so much, Professor Sunil Ray, for your wonderful thoughts. And I'm delighted, and I express my pure honor and privilege to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of the IMPRI Center for Human Dignity and Development, Center for Development Communications and Studies, CDEX, Jaipur, to our eminent speaker, Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi. So we are absolutely delighted and privileged to have learned from you, to have heard you. Please accept our gratitude. I would also like to thank all our discussants for the day who spoke passionately, Dr. Mansee Bal Bhargava, Dr. Arup Kumar Sen, Professor Atanu Sengupta, and Dr. Gopal Krishna. Thank you to all of you for your enriching inputs. And lastly, and most of all, the moderator of the series, Professor Sunil Ray. Thank you so much, sir. We are learning by your guidance and by your mentorship. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank all our attendees here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. Thank you for watching the program, and to all those who will be watching us later, the program on YouTube, and also listening to the program on different podcasts. Thank you, and I wish you all a very, very good day, and please stay safe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Sir.